So thank you very much. Let me first of all thank you, Martin, for having initiated this, and then of course the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for being so generous and sponsoring this, and the National Library for hosting this. So this is a beautiful opportunity for me to be in this building, which I have never been before, and it's just really astounding. Today I will talk, the lecture has the title Coming to Terms with the Past, the Politics of Truth and Justice in the Baltic States. It is very much based on this book, Transitional and Retrospective Justice in the Baltic States, which I can pass around for you to have a look. And there are also flyers for those of you who are interested to actually purchase it. Anyways, but the lecture is based on this study, which is a comparative survey of the politics of what we call the politics of truth and justice, the way the Baltic states have addressed on very many different levels the crimes and abuses of the previous communist regime over the past 25 years, actually 25 years. So starting in 1990 all the way until we finished the manuscript, which was basically in 2014. We do this in a systematic comparative way. On the one hand, we look at the three Baltic states, of course, separately, but we compare them throughout the book quite clearly. And this we do on the basis of a model that we develop, which allows us to really map out the full scale of different state measures that are available to newly democratizing states to address these past wrongs. And this is what is meant by transitional justice usually. Transitional justice refers, for those who don't know it, refers to exactly this, how states that emerge from a non-democratic regime and engage or and go onto the path of democracy and the rule of law, how they, if they and how they address the crimes and the abuses of the previous regime, hold those who committed them accountable and redress or compensate those who suffered under the previous regime. We came to this idea of doing the study on the three Baltic states from basically three realizations. One was that in the literature on transitional justice in Eastern Europe, we have a very strong focus on just Central Europe and increasingly on Southeastern Europe, but there was a big empirical gap up here in the north. The Baltic states, as usual in these kind of comparative research, were lumped into one, treated as if they were just one country. Mostly arguing, that's the usual argument in the social science, in the comparative social science, that they have these kind of very similar to historical trajectories. They were all subjected to Soviet rule, so Soviet communist rule, and they, to the day they experience almost the same policies of repression, and then they came out of it and engaged and embarked on democracy, also very much a parallel. So it must be the same. The policies that followed must be all the same. And so we realized not only was there a gap in the treatment of the Baltics, but there was also much misconception about what is going on here in this field. So there was this empirical aim that we had to fill this gap. And then on another empirical level, there was the realization that transitional justice research in the post-communist world focuses very much, with very few exceptions, on just one measure, which is so-called lustration, which is basically an umbrella term for very many different policies, including purging the system, the state system, the ministries, the police forces, whatever other state institution of those people who had worked for the repressive regime, mostly for the secret police, but sometimes even going further from that in the higher ranks of the Communist Party or other way. And so purging the system or preventing those who work for the KGB or for the secret police from ever running for public office. So vetting, it's a vetting procedure to vet people against existing files if they exist, to make sure that they won't get a position in the public sector. So since this is an obvious area where all post-communist states had to that was a very burning question in most of these countries that came from communist regimes and embarked on democracy, indeed, what to do with these networks, with these secret police institutions that had worked for over 50 years, you know, were really deep in society. What to do with them? That was a very, very important question, and that maybe explains why those interested in explaining why politicians, why new democratic leaders actually decide to pass laws and to sanction these people, focused on this area of transitional justice most. However, there are very many other possibilities as well, not just to punish and sanction the perpetrators, but also to redress, to compensate, to rehabilitate, and to remember the victims. And there was relatively little done, actually, in the comparative political science literature on transitional justice. And so we figured, in order to really understand, you know, where a country stands in this field, what, you know, how it develops and how the politics emerge over these issues of truth and justice, we need to get the full picture. We need to really understand how and in what way the state has engaged in all the different fields that are possible to engage with, both measures towards the victims and the perpetrators. And so we devised a model that is actually based on existing, on a few existing models, but we have expanded on that to get a more systematic overview and to map out the country's sort of profile in this field. So I will, the way I will now structure this talk is that I first walk you through that matrix, that model that we developed, because it really structures the way also the book is written and the whole study makes sense, and it makes you also realize what's the comparative value of doing this and how the three Baltic states can be compared on this, in this field that is usually very specific because of the very specific pasts and crimes that countries undergo. And yet the three Baltic states allow us to then really develop a sort of a typology of truth and justice patterns that emerge. So it's basically a threefold endeavor that we have engaged in, which is then to develop this holistic model, to fill the gap on the Baltic states and really bring all the analysis of all the different laws, all the different policies and institutions and politics surrounding them over the last 25 years. And finally, to compare them and develop a sort of a typological model to perhaps apply that also to other post-communist countries and to thus get a better picture of types of of truth and justice politics. Now, starting with this model, there is an immediate dichotomy that comes to mind when you think about what measures of truth and justice, of truth-seeking and rendering justice for past wrongs involve. They are usually directed at either victims or perpetrators, however these two categories are being defined by the state. Historians, whenever I've presented this model, historians immediately jumped at me and said, like, yes, but, you know, there are so many categories in between perpetrator and victim, because they're all, you know, what about collaborators, what about those who were first victims and then perpetrators, the bystanders, you know, whatever else you can find. Of course, as a historian, you look always at the gray shades, and that's fair enough. But in our purpose was not to have any kind of moral judgment here or normative understanding of who could be considered a perpetrator and who could be a victim, but we take what the states themselves define, because this is what is also then contentious sometimes and is being developed and categories are widened, but we are interested in how the state frames his measures vis-a-vis what he defines, or the state defines, the law defines as victim and as perpetrator. And then you find in the literature another dichotomy that very early on, when people started writing about this field, mostly in the area with regard to the democratization processes in Latin America, they differentiate between judicial ways of dealing with the past through the courts, through the legal system of a country, devising criminal laws, you know, charging people, investigating people, charging people, bringing them to the courts, convicting them, or rehabilitating victims, cleaning their criminal records from previous times. And then they also they have the criminal judicial, and then the other category is the non-judicial way a state can also sanction or redress perpetrators or victims. And under non-judicial, then usually you find measures such as truth commissions subsumed, or opening the archives. These are measures that help to render justice, to bring truth to light, to recognize the victims, to give them a voice, to give them some sort of official recognition, however, that has no judicial dimension to it. It doesn't go through the courts. So it's a non-judicial. But when we thought about all the different possibilities that a state has, we realized there are actually two subcategories of this non-judicial dimension. One being what we call political administrative, and the other symbolic representational. And indeed, when you sort the entire scope of measures that exist out there along these two dimensions, perpetrator, victim directed, and then on different levels, criminal, judicial, political, administrative, and symbolic representational, you arrive at a beautiful matrix that relates the different measures to each other in a meaningful way. So you can actually see how they hang together. It's not just the usual laundry list that you find in the literature of, you know, this, and this, and this is all the different options that the state has, but we can see that they hang together, that we have, on the criminal judicial level, we have measures that are directed at victims and at perpetrators. You have the criminal trials against perpetrators, former generals, former high-up secret police officials, and you have the rehabilitation of people who had been criminalized by the previous regime and whose records are being cleaned through the courts. And then on the political administrative level, you have what I have referred to before as lustration. You have administrative procedures, regulation that don't allow certain people to run for public office, that vet them, that check them against existing KGB files, that purge them from the system, those who already work in it, that list their names in public, in state bulletins, etc. So you have the whole lustration area is pretty much an administrative procedure. It doesn't go through the courts. It's not criminal. This is the problem very often post-communism, that you cannot hold criminally liable people for the abuses that they did, because they did it according to the law. And if you want to follow the rule of law in the new democracy, you cannot punish them retroactively for something that was legal at the time. And on the victim side, also not on the judicial, but on the administrative level, you have all sorts of policies to compensate the victims. You have property restitution. You give property back to those people who lost them, that was taken away by the communist regime or confiscated by whatever other unjust regime. You compensate victims in different ways, sometimes with actual pensions, sometimes just by giving them social benefits, special health care, etc. But these are all administrative procedures, again, not legal, not criminal, legal ones. And then finally, you have also a symbolic level. And that is a very interesting one that many post-communist countries have been extremely active in, especially those who were more hesitant to really do too much on the political or the criminal judicial level, which is to give recognition to the victims. And this you do through symbolic, we call them symbolic measures because they have no administrative consequences or judicial consequences to them. You have memorial days, you set up memorial sites, you establish a truth commission to investigate the identity of the victims and to name them so that they are finally seen and recognized for what they have gone through. You remember them. You have these in the Baltics, obviously, the many remembrance days throughout the year, including today. But today is actually a different one that is, strictly speaking, not in the transitional justice category, but the 14th of June, remembering the victims of the first deportation, and many others that give politicians an opportunity to put down flowers, to meet with survivors, with former deportees, and give some sort of official public recognition to them every year. But it's symbolic. It doesn't really cost the state very much in that sense. It doesn't involve a major administrative procedure, and it clearly doesn't involve the courts either. Okay, so this is a very basic matrix that helps you already to understand the different dimensions that we look at in our study in all three Baltic states. But now what we realized in the particular post-communist context, which has been insufficiently thematized, even though it appears in very many different studies, is that in the particular post-communist context where the regime lasted for so many decades, you have the situation that truth and justice measures apply to quite different crimes that happen at different times. So there are different temporalities involved in the politics of truth and justice that are very worthwhile pointing out, because they make for a different analytical quality when you are interested in the politics that evolve around these measures, these matters. So on the one hand, you have the classic traditional justice, which is the justice that is the truth and justice measures that are that address violations of human rights, major abuses committed by the previous regime, and they do that in the immediate transition period. So in the very short period of the first years of democratic transition, when actually the legal system isn't quite yet established, when very often these are very much ad hoc measures that are implemented hastily, and in the Baltics we have several examples where indeed things were done too fast, like the rehabilitation in Lithuania of people who had been convicted under the communists was very quickly done. Several hundred people got rehabilitated, only to then it turns out that some of them had been actually convicted for real crimes, which was mostly connected to the Nazi occupation. They had been involved in the killing and torture of Jewish Lithuanians. So the immediate transitional justice, to come back here, the immediate transitional justice is really in a very short time frame around the transition, before the system is fully consolidated, or even in the consolidation process. So it's actually over by the first proper return, the classic end of transition idea of the proper return of or turn of a government coalition with the former opposition party coming to power in a peaceful way, everybody accepting the rules of the game. That's when the transition is over, and that's also when the transitional justice is over, according to our understanding. Because then comes a different temporality, and that is very, very important to understand in the Baltics. It involves a whole different set of politics, of political motives, of dynamics between the political elites to push for these measures, which concerns crimes that happened many decades earlier. We call this retrospective justice. We call it retrospective justice also because it's yet different from historical justice. So the victims of this retrospective may still be alive. It's not that this is some kind of crime that happened at a time that is really historical, that is really long ago, but retrospective does still involve victims and perpetrators, and yet it happened very, very many decades ago. And it's not, when you look at it from a political point of view, it's less cost intensive for political elites to engage in these kind of truth and justice measures. It's much less risky in political terms than to go after people who might still be in power or who hold strong positions in society. So retrospective justice concerns crimes that happened a long time ago. And then there is a third dimension, which I will come to in a moment when I go into the cases, which is actually that many states do not actually pass so many laws and implement measures in the immediate transition period. They take much longer. They pass laws like 10 years later, like the Polish government passed the lustration law only in 1999. What took them so long? The question is, why do governments return to the issue of truth and justice for previous regime crimes and establish laws and regulations and institutions of truth-seeking so many years after the transition is over? This has been termed post-transitional justice. We are a bit more careful in framing that term, but this is nevertheless an important temporality that comes out in our matrix when we actually look at the development of the policies and politics over 20 years. But it's actually these two, transitional and retrospective justice, that occur immediately in the matrix. So let's return to the matrix. And what we arrive at is this. I don't know how much you can really read this. It's probably a bit small on the screen. That's too bad. I will walk you through it systematically, then you will understand. So we have divided the 6 boxes that we had before, each in, we've divided them, so we arrive at 12 boxes, always one retrospective, one transitional, vis-a-vis victims and perpetrators. So to start with the first, we have, and here I will give you already examples from the Baltic states to make it a little bit more juicy and more understandable perhaps. The first box, the the criminal judicial box, involves then laws, criminal justice framework, criminal law frameworks that allow the state to investigate and prosecute perpetrators. And it does, in the Baltic case, you have the situation that in the very early 90s, it was one of the first things in Latvia, but also then in the other two, the 3 states adhere to the international conventions on genocide, as well as on the non-existence of statutory limitations for crimes against humanity. So they adhere to the international conventions, and they include the understanding of genocide and crimes against humanity in their criminal codes. They do that in very different ways. Lithuania passes a very sort of hasty ad hoc law in '92 on the liability for genocide, framing genocide in a very broad sense as directed against all sorts of groups, not just the ones that I identified in the international law, but going beyond that and clearly saying the crimes committed by the Nazi and communist occupation powers constitute genocide. The other 2 countries, Latvia and Lithuania and Estonia, make amendments to their existing criminal code, the Soviet-era criminal code, and put these 3 provisions, crimes against humanity, genocide, and war crimes in there, but also taking this very broad understanding, which allows them then to indeed investigate and prosecute people who, over 80-year-old men who had worked for the NKVD and their later organizations to deport civilians, to fight the partisans after the war, etc., and bring them to the courts. The numbers are very different in the 3 states in the sense, if you compare them, Lithuania has been the most vigorous and really putting lots of resources into this, going after these people, especially focusing, interestingly, not on the deportations of the 40s, but focusing mostly on the post-war partisan war, which is also framed as genocide. So anyone who can be proved to have shot a partisan or have been involved in discovering a partisan and killing him can be charged for genocide, and indeed many people have been convicted for that. So the Baltics have been relatively active. Latvia had seen very few cases only. That has different reasons. I don't know, I can't really go into all the details here. It stops pretty much in Latvia around 2000, that new investigations are no longer taken up for different reasons, mostly legal reasons. The numbers in Latvia are very small. I don't remember, I think it was altogether 7 convicted individuals convicted for war crimes and crimes against humanity / genocide, which is 1 paragraph, or used to be 1 paragraph. In Estonia, slightly more. Lithuania by far outnumbers the 2 others. So this is on the judicial criminal. On the transitional justice level, there has been very little. Again, it's the same thing. You establish the laws, but it's very difficult if you, as I said before, want to follow the rule of laws. You cannot easily punish people who haven't been involved in crimes that can clearly be defined in international criminal terms. On the rehabilitation level, I also already said something. Again, they were mostly active on the retrospective, so on the rehabilitation of people who had been deported or otherwise convicted on political paragraphs during the 40s and 50s, but also in later years, transitional rehabilitations. Now, on the political administrative level in the Baltics, you have, and it's sort of natural that, of course, most effort goes into the transitional justice box. So you have, again, very vastly different policies of of lustration in the 3 states, with Estonia basically the mildest, passing the mildest provisions already in their constitution. They have a provision that everyone should make an oath of conscience, declaring whether or not they have worked for any kind of secret police, whether the Nazi, the communist, or any other international intelligence service. And there is a certain deadline by which time they have to declare this or submit this oath of conscience, and after that nobody speaks about this anymore. It's over. There is, of course, this has to be filed with the Security Police Board, and they have always the possibility of investigating these people, but they usually don't do that. And then there's slightly later another measure where they give an incentive. They say, okay, we allow you to stay anonymous in return of if you give us the truth about your involvement with the KGB. So they trade truth against justice, if you want. They want to know how the KGB worked in Estonia. That is more important than actually exposing these people or sanctioning them in any ways. And indeed, over 1,000 people come forward and report themselves voluntarily and are being interrogated, and then their names will never be published. Those who don't report themselves and are found out to have worked for the KGB are indeed exposed. Their names are being published. Over many years, there are regular lists published by the Security Police Board, and it's left to the Estonian people to decide what to do with these people. There is no further sanctioning, so that's why we actually put the voluntary self-reporting into the symbolic measure box, because it really has no administrative dimension to it. Latvia had, as you all know, probably the lustration sort of in many different, there's no single lustration law, there are many different laws that sort of deal with this issue, mainly the most important one being the electoral law of '93, which says that all people running for public office have to be vetted against the files that are existing, and basically in the hands of the early established TSDC, the Totalitarismo Saku Dokumentācijas Centre, which the checkers might are with them, but also more data, and they have the task to indeed investigate this further and identify both victims and KGB operatives, and do interrogations, find out who is in the files, what was their role, etc. So there is some data available, and based on that, indeed, individuals who want to run for public office can be vetted and can be checked. And there are several cases which you will all remember, where people holding office, holding government office even, are being declared that they have worked for the KGB and they have to resign or otherwise prove in court that they are innocent. This is a provision that was put into place very early on. It only concerns really KGB employees, or, you know, as far as the files can tell what their role was. It doesn't go any further, and yet it is consistent. So it is still in place, and it's a consistent policy that doesn't end. And in Lithuania, there's for a long time nothing except for some early purges of the parliament. But due to the fact that the ex-communists come back into power already in '92, there's nothing happening, and then come the big elections in '96. When the National Conservatives come back, and then they pass actually a full-scale lustration law. So Lithuania in the Baltic states is the only country that actually has passed a lustration law regulating the banning of people who've worked for the KGB for 20 years. They want to originally even expand into the private sector, and then the European Court of Human Rights rules against that, and they have to cut back, but their lustration law is quite extensive. On the victim side, you have also very different extents of compensation measures. Lithuania pays full pensions for certain categories of victims. Lithuania also has an extensive list of categories of victims, whereas Estonia and Latvia are much smaller in that sense. They are also not really paying direct pensions, but more giving social benefits, special healthcare. Estonia actually has nothing all the way until 2003, when finally the Conservative Party, the Pro-Partia, is pushing a law through that envisions compensation for victims of deportation, former deportees. And then finally, on the symbolic level, we have the condemnation of the communist regime, of course. We have many declarations by parliament of all three countries condemning the communist regime as criminal. We have the set up of historical commissions that not only research the fate of victims and the names of victims, but also the kind of the structure of repression and the institutions of repression clearly determining responsibilities. So this belongs also on the perpetrator side. Again, the Baltics are much more active on the retrospective dimension, researching the 40s and 50s rather than the 60s and 70s and 80s. On the victim side, we have the setting up of institutions of remembrance. The strongest one, supported by the state fully, is of course the Genocide and Resistance Research Center in Vilnius, which combines under its roof, that's also why it's on the front of our book, combines under its roof actually every single field in our matrix. So the Genocide and Resistance Research Center does everything. The Illustration Commission sits under that roof. The Museum of Genocide sits under that roof. They do memory work with survivors and victims. They work with the Prosecutor General's office to find evidence against former NKVD operatives. So they help victims with filing rehabilitation applications and compensation applications, etc. So they are really active in every single dimension. That's why we put it in front of our book. It's in one single state-funded institution that really all these aspects of truth and justice are being dealt with. The Latvia and Estonia have a much more complex picture in the sense that victim organizations, former deportees or repressed people organizations are NGOs, get some state funding but very little. In Estonia they have to even apply for it all the time and compete with other NGOs, so they have no permanent funding. Much of their truth seeking, which is extensive, like identifying the people who have been deported, finding out where they died or whether they are still alive, etc. All of that is done basically on the basis of donation and not necessarily state funds. So both countries are very less involved with their state resources in truth seeking and compensation of victims. However, of course, things like official remembrance days are being set up, memorial sites are being funded, and so forth. And of course, you have the historical commissions that, at least in Estonia, one of these historical commissions, the parliamentary one, the abbreviation of which is ORURK, they are there to measure and to count the damages done. So not just the number of victims, but also the damage done in economic terms, in ecological terms, and on all sorts of other dimensions. And to give a white book, give a report on that, it takes them over 10 years, but eventually that is done. That is clearly a more victim-oriented measure, whereas the historical commission, I would place the historical commission in Estonia more on the perpetrator side, because their task is really to determine responsibilities, to name the perpetrators. So this has already given you quite a bit of an insight of what's going on in the Baltic states on the basis of this measure. But now methodologically, how do we bring this all together and how do we compare these panoramas that we are sort of painting here of these three states? And that becomes the very tricky question, because our claim is that, that by systematically mapping out the different measures, how they changed over time, what politics was involved in there, what kind of interests were fighting each other to implement a particular law, to change a particular law, to introduce a new memorial day, to expand victim categories, etc. All of that, you know, brings in this third temporal dimension that I mentioned before, and actually evolves into a particular pattern, a country pattern, as we call it. And now I have to move on here. Exactly. So our aim is to identify, once we have filled all these boxes for one country, to identify the extent to which each state pursues policies of truth and justice with regard to both more distant and more recent crimes, both transitional and retrospective, and to identify the processes and the timing of policy debates, new legislative initiatives, and changes made to existing policies. So bring that third time temporality in, show how this evolves over time. And the goal of which is to then identify overarching matrix-wide regularities that combine into generalized patterns. So do we arrive at some sort of pattern of each country that allow us to then place them on some sort of scale where they stand in their policies of truth and justice? And indeed, we discussed it extensively when we had finished all the empirical work, like what is it that really makes the difference? And of course the most intuitive one is that you can differentiate then ideal-typically between cases where the state is massively involved in truth and justice, where lots of resources and lots of political resources are being invested to confront the crimes and the wrongs of the past, to redress the victims, to punish the perpetrators, and also to lead the discourse and to sort of take a leading position as the state, as state institutions, through legislature, through parliamentary condemnations, like you find in Lithuania almost every month. You have some new martyr being declared by parliament, always the highest levels of the state being involved. And so ideal typical, we would try to place these three countries, and of course potentially all sorts of other post-communist countries, along a scale that reaches from very etatist, very state-centered, to a very inactive state, a state that just says, I can't be bothered, I leave this all to, you know, civil society to deal with. Or even actively preventing these things from happening, like in the Spanish case where there was an active non-remembrance going on. So this would be the kind of ideal typical scale on which then the typological cases could be placed. What I don't go into detail now is that, of course, on each ideal type you have also another dimension that is more almost economic, but also political risk-taking that is involved in each of these measures. So you can actually look at the matrix also from the cost-benefit calculation that are involved with the politicians and see that, of course, judicial criminal measures are more cost-intense, both in terms of finances, in terms of legal provisions and actual activity, as well as in potential political costs for those who push for them, whereas symbolic measures are the least cost-intense. So strongly etatist states are also very risk-taking in many ways. They just go for it. They don't care, you know, whether this costs them the vote in the next election. Whereas the inactive state is usually also the state that doesn't want to touch these issues because it might be too dangerous. I have to look, yeah, I've had some more time. I know it doesn't move again. What is this? No, I don't. Yeah. So this is how it looks in the end, which I don't go too much into detail. There's a lot of methodological criticism that we got here, and of course it is difficult to indeed we shied away from giving these measures numbers, simply to code them, because it's very difficult of how you actually code them on a particular scale from 1 to 5 or something, to really then compare them on a more on that kind of numeric level. But we nevertheless gave them gray shades as far as Word allowed us to identify certain gray shades. We determined, based on, of course, certain criteria, based on the scope, the extent of a particular policy, like in the first box, for example, the number of convicts or the number of cases that were brought to court, but also the severity of the legal charges. So if you compare, for example, Lithuania and Estonia, you find out that in Lithuania, actually a majority of cases were brought to the courts on charges of genocide, of no less than genocide, which is sort of the crime of crimes. Whereas Estonia was much more careful in really basing their argument, their legal argument, on international law rather than only their national definition, and just shied away from defining these crimes as genocide because they could not prove genocidal intention in the courts. But they could still charge them for crimes against humanity, which is a horrendous crime as well. However, there is a qualitative difference between the two. So this goes into the measuring of measures and into the gray shades. And what we, of course, also see here is these are the years right? So this is where the dimension, the third temporal dimension comes in. So we show the development over time in each of these boxes. And we see in Lithuania, which is particularly interesting, I know for some reason it never wants. Yeah, so this is the dimension. One aspect, I don't go too much into each box, but one aspect is that Lithuania even not only pushes much more, puts much more money into this, but in 2008, as late as 2008, when both other Baltic states have actually long ceased to investigate new cases and maybe bring the last cases still to court, but don't really investigate any new cases, Lithuania puts an additional amount of money from its state budget into hiring 33 new prosecutors to look into cases from the 50s, look into the partisan war mostly, and bring people still to court. And until 2 weeks ago, I think 2 weeks ago it was, there was just another conviction done on an 88-year-old convicted for genocide for having killed a partisan in as late as 57. So even after Stalin's death. So they really continue this process. They are still very much invested in this. Another thing is what I already mentioned is this very sharp darkening. This indicates the election of '96. This is when and you see that throughout the boxes at around '96, '97, you see a sharp increase of activity, which is due to the electoral cycle that the National Conservatives, the Sajudis, the former Sajudis, the Landsbergis party is coming back and immediately centralizing the entire thing, putting all the different institutions that existed before under one roof, creating this Genocide and Resistance Research Center, passing the law on lustration, changing the criminal code to be more effective. Going really through the boxes, you see everywhere a very strong push due to political changes. And of course here you see also very dark shade on the victim side, where you have a lot of activity in the center, in the Genocide and Resistance Research Center, in terms of identifying the victims, remembering them, doing memory work with them, documenting their stories, and setting up memorials. And all of that is state funded, is fully state funded through the center. In Latvia, you see the gray shades are slightly lighter. You have, what is interesting in the Latvian case is that you have also relative sharp decrease. Rather than increase, you have decreases. So as I mentioned before, in Latvia, basically investigations into new criminal cases relating to crimes committed in the 40s and 50s end in 99, 2000. Mostly due to the fact that the law just doesn't provide, even the new criminal law does not provide a provision for crimes against humanity. And it is just too daunting to charge somebody for genocide if you cannot be completely sure that you can actually prove genocidal intent. And so any prosecutor thinks twice before he does that. And also political support goes markedly down here. And so you have a relative rapid. And also there's a new prosecutor general, that's another, it's a sort of more idiosyncratic factor that comes in here, that altogether result in some few cases still being finished, including Kononov and several others that still go to court in the early 2000s, but no new cases being taken up. This one, can you imagine what that is? It's on the symbolic level and it's transitional. And it's in Latvia, so what could that be? It's the notorious debate on opening the Čekas that actually came up in 2004 already, as you might all remember, and got as far, that's why we gave it a dark gray, it got as far as being actually passed by Saeima to open, and then Vairāvīti vetoed it twice, and then it disappeared, and that's why it gets light again. So it got actually quite far. It was, the opening, the indiscriminate opening of the Čekas was approved by Parliament, but through a very, surprising kind of vote. But then it was vetoed twice, and it didn't. As you can see, our timeline doesn't go until 2014. Otherwise, it would have gotten dark again in the end. But I don't know how I would actually put the current debate and the current solution of what happens with these Čekas files, whether I would give it a very dark shade, because after all, they are not opening the thing indiscriminately. So in that sense, it's not really too dark. that would really constitute a relatively harsh and extreme measure. That I already pointed out, that was the illustration or the vetting procedures that are in place that are relatively restricted to just a few former KGB employees, and yet it are consistent, and so the gray shade stays the same over time. And now finally Estonia, where you see it's even lighter. You know, it gets lighter and lighter as we walk up to the north. Here you see a relative, compared to the others, relative late passing of criminal laws, but then a very consistent, low-level, consistent investigation of cases that's dwindled out in the 2000s because people simply die or are no longer up for trials. What is interesting, perhaps in Estonia, is also here it gets lighter. It's the story I told before, that you have the oath of conscience, you have the voluntary self-reporting, but both measures actually end. They end, which is something new in the area. I mean, very often these measures don't end, they are extended and extended, like in Czech Republic, they are constantly extended. Estonia finishes, it closes measures. It gives a certain deadline, it doesn't go over that. And so they end, you know, and those who have not reported themselves have not reported themselves. And they might be published, but, you know, it doesn't really have consequences. The only dark one in Estonia, this is a divided box because we differentiate between compensation measures and restitution, property restitution. And Estonia is the only country among the three that has been extremely consistent and strong in terms of property restitution. Again, it gave a very early deadline by which time everybody had to submit the papers from the archives about the ownership of a particular property, and then it was restituted. It was a bit extended into mid-90s, but then that ended. But it was very far-reaching. There was no deviling around. It was given back, which caused, it was very high risk-taking in political terms, because it caused all sorts of social trouble with the so-called forced renters emerged, and people living in these houses suddenly having new landlords and being faced with either being thrown out, or there was no regulation helping them finding apartments or anything. So it caused a lot of social unrest and debate, and yet the politicians were dead set to do this, which was an interesting thing given the fact that across the other boxes, Estonia is rather, understatement, so to say. So that's interesting. Otherwise, Estonia is consistently less involved, less eager to lead the particular policy, and more leaving it to civil society groups, victim organizations, etc. And here, this is the establishment of the commission, of the historical commission, basically, where it gets slightly darker. But that as well is actually closed. It's ended. It doesn't continue, the commission, like in Lithuania and in Latvia. The historical commission has been finished after it submitted a report, as it should be. So, coming slowly to the end, placing them on this scale then, I would say Lithuania is probably about here, Estonia is probably about here, and Latvia somewhere here. We gave it actually names. Lithuania we called the hands-on state, obviously. Very hands-on, very active, very much determined to lead the debate and lead in all sorts of areas. The state shows an ardent determination to provide strong and enduring legal, administrative and symbolic frames to facilitate truth and justice, and seeks to lead, through institutional, legislative and financial means, processes across the entire matrix, across the realms of truth and justice. This is how we define the hands-on. Latvia we call sort of the ambivalent state. We chose that term. It's not just the in-between state, but it's ambivalent in the sense, and we define it in this way. The state provides relatively far-reaching legal, administrative, and symbolic frames to facilitate truth and justice. All sorts of institutions are set up. The legal frameworks are put in place. Everything is there. Yet is characterized by a lack of political stamina in sustaining them or in supplying the established institution with sufficient resources to carry out their work. This is why it gets lighter in the end. This has, of course, also idiosyncratic reasons because of economic crisis and these kind of factors. And yet there is a general tendency that political support dwindles out, is not really there, and institutions are not getting sufficient sustainable support over time. And then finally, Estonia being the hands-off state, The state provides some legal administrative frameworks to facilitate truth and justice processes, but it declines to use its regulatory power and resources for implementing laws and policies. Like, you know, the Security Police Board could have investigated all these people who didn't report themselves. They didn't. They didn't care. So, you know, there is not really a will to put this on the agenda and make this a major thing. It declines to use its regulatory power and resources for implementing laws and policies, instead leaving much of the struggle for truth and justice to non-state actors such as deportees, organizations, and other victim groups. We have, of course, in the end of the book also tried to explain this a little bit, but this goes probably now too far. There are the distal factors, of course, Lithuanians' determination, and also the extent of their policies, both in remembrance term as well as in judicial terms, can be in part explained with the character of the historical conflict. I mean, the partisan war was a partisan war that happened after the war, right? Whereas in Latvia and Estonia, the forest brethren, that they had a struggle, but it was much less organized. There were much fewer men in the woods. In Lithuania, they went as far as declaring the general, the head of the partisan movement, the president of Lithuania, posthumously. So, you know, there was a clear structure of command and very well organized. There were different partisan districts across the country where certain, you know, platoons or whatever you call them then were active. And so that dimension, that simply the extent of the historical conflict explains some of the willingness of Lithuanians today to still go on and on about researching this and bringing these people to justice who fought these partisans. But then there are, of course, these more proximate factors, such as the type of the regime you have, and that is an interesting factor in Lithuania that is completely different from Estonia and Latvia, is that you have an emerging party cleavage after the transition. Or first of all, you have a type of the past regime that actually alienates Lithuania much more with Poland in the sense that there was a certain legitimacy and a certain trust in the Communist Lithuanian Party, which has been explained by historians. I don't know how much that is really the only reason. But one reason is that they successfully fended off Russians from immigrating. So there was a nativization of the Lithuanian Communist Party that was far more than it was ever in Latvia and Estonia, where you had these Russian Estonians, Russian Latvians mostly on the top positions. And so this feeling of being ruled by someone else was less present in Lithuania to some extent than in the other two, which explains the popularity of the ex-Communist Party after '92 coming back into power right away, just changing their mantle, calling themselves Social Democrats and being actually in power again, just like in Poland in '92, which didn't happen. There's no post-Communist Party in neither Latvia nor Estonia. So that explains this extreme polarization of the political landscape over these issues, not just these issues, but these particular, with the National Conservatives, Landsbergis, you know, whenever they come to power, they have to, you know, throw everything over and make everything better than their predecessors. And then the Social Democrats come back into power and they do nothing. They don't dismantle the policies, but they just don't do anything really in this field. So, you know, things go down. But this is the constant back and forth, which sort of raises the stakes, the political stakes each time, and that might explain some of these dark shades in certain of these fields. And then for foreign relations I put here, which is the Russia factor, which comes in Latvia particularly much, more than in Estonia, interestingly, in that Russia has intervened a lot. But Latvia is the only country, state among the three that actually has a viable ethnic party sitting in the Saeima. And even though they are never in power and they are always in the eternal opposition, they make for a much more contentious political atmosphere on these issues of truth and justice. And so it is a risk factor that Latvian politicians have to take into account. So both Russians in the countries as well as Russia outside, constantly interfering, helping defense lawyers in trials, you know, doing public propaganda among Russian speakers, you know, about the fascist Latvian, you know, whatever. That plays a role because it makes this a much higher political risk for Latvian politicians to really invest a lot here. That might explain some of the lacking political support for some of it. Not because they don't want to try these people, or they don't want truth and justice, but because they simply think other things are more important and it's too cost intense. That might explain some. And then finally, there are some idiosyncratic factors. As I mentioned before, the economic crisis, of course, made a huge impact on funding all of these public institutions of research and investigation, but then also individual memory agency plays a role. Individual agents like Mayra Freiberger, for whom this was a very strong topic that she, especially of the remembrance and explaining of the fate of Latvians to the Western world. So she supported the Historical Commission particularly much. And she was, in that sense, it plays a role. Lennart Meri as well, with his campaign. Shortly before his administration was over, he launched a campaign across Estonia to give former deportees a token of a broken cornflower, and to literally shake their hand, put that token on, give them recognition, buchstäblich. And so that was very strong personal agency that was involved. He wanted to do that before he left. He wanted to give that recognition. So that also sometimes plays a role in shading our boxes, right? Making it darker or not. And finally, the book also goes into the international dimension. I will not go too much into this, just mention it, that there are, of course, different dimensions again in how much these truth and justice processes in the Baltic states reverberate across the border. I already mentioned Russia. There is, of course, an eternal issue with Russia on reparation claims, actually from both sides. The Baltic states having all now written up reparation claims towards Russia as the legal successor of the Soviet Union, but also Russia making claims towards the Baltic states, saying, well, during the Soviet period we invested so much, you have to give us something back for the property or whatever industrial investment we made. But then there's also the very direct Russian intervention in domestic justice processes, really trying to influence trial outcomes and public remembrance, the constant commenting on remembrance practices. So this adds certainly an additional political dimension. But then there's also the European level, where Baltic politicians in particular have campaigned a lot to get the memory of, or get a criminalization of communism, not just a condemnation, a symbolic condemnation, but an actual criminalization in the framework of the Framework Convention for Genocide, for xenophobia, anti-Semitism, and something else, in which framework there was a debate whether to criminalize the denial of the Holocaust. And the Eastern Europeans, and the Baltics in particular, went forward and said, like, well, if you do that, then we want also the denial of the communist crimes to be criminalized. That didn't go through. In the end, neither of the two went through. But nevertheless, Latvia, all three countries, as you all know, passed legislation that banned symbols of the Soviet regime, and two of them banned also the denial, or criminalized the denial of the or trivialization of the deportations and the criminal character. On the judicial level, we had several cases that were appealed to the European Court of Human Rights, which is Kononov. This is the most prominent one from Latvia, which actually got confirmed. Estonia got all of its cases that went to the European Court confirmed. That was mostly due to the fact that they had convicted for crimes against humanity, and nobody denies that the deportations were crimes against humanity. However, those cases from Latvia and Lithuania that had actually charged for genocide and convicted for genocide, or sort of unclear whether it was genocide or crimes against humanity, because the law doesn't really say, they were so-called communicated back to the governments. So the European Court felt uncomfortable about these cases, but couldn't really say anything because it was based on domestic jurisdiction. And so that's not in the power of the court to say something, but they felt uneasy about this kind of jurisdiction. The Kononov case is, of course, an extreme case where Latvia finally, after long back and forth, got its judgment confirmed. So now I think I have taken your time long enough, and I finish here. And I hope I didn't go much into detail in what respect our matrix, our mapping of these fields border into the broader field of memory politics. That is something that maybe Walters wants to go into, to what extent these transitional truth and justice measures that are really targeted measures at particular victim groups or particular perpetrators also contribute to the broader creation of narratives, of historical narratives, and of collective national memory of this period. That is an interesting field that we do not explore very much in the book, but that would sort of be an interesting direction to go into. But I end here, and I thank you for your attention. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Labi. Paldies liels par šo lielisko prezentāciju. Man patiesībā, tad, kad man bija tā iespēja lasīt manuskriptu grāmatas, tas bija pirmais, kas man patiesībā satrieca, cik mēs Latvijā bieži vien vienkārši esam un mēģinam domāt par šo vēsturiskā un pārējais laika taisnīgumu par Baltijas reģionu kā kaut ko ļoti vienotu, un patiesībā šī grāmata ilustrē, cik tas ir sarežģīti un cik tas ir sazaroti un cik mēs esam atšķirīgi šajā reģionā bijuši pēdējo 25 gadu laikā. Un es vēlētos tādēļ aicināt Walteru Nollendorfu, lai ieskicētu varbūt dažas svarīgas pārdomas par šo te pētījumu.
Shall I sit down? I think
I sit down. Let me sit here and you can stand there. It's really small.
There are people here. First of all, this is what I call prime example of Baltic studies. Absolutely a prime, and actually in many respects trailblazing, or as the Germans put it, bahnbrechend, pioneering. I used to work in the Baltic Studies Association for many years, was even president for a while, got hell for bringing up the Holocaust issues in exile and so on. But in Baltic studies, as we developed it especially in the Americas, in Baltic studies, usually the Estonians did their thing, the Latvians did their thing, the Lithuanians did their thing, but the three met basically at parties, had in other longer discussions. So from that point of view, there were no trailblazing such studies which put it on a comparative basis. So therefore, I would say this is putting it actually in perspective, and I especially think that your matrix is a masterwork because it allows you to analyze and it allows you to compare, and that is incomparable. Okay, the matrix. The matrix. To me, and I will address these memory issues and how we deal with these memory issues, because the legal issues, of course, we have provided material that we have gathered in the Occupation Museum to prosecution, and especially when prosecutor Strelis was active, he came to us very often and provided us with documents that he had obtained and so on. We are not in the judgment part in the museum, but looking at it again totally, it is a huge understanding, a huge undertaking to establish a legal, social, and public awareness, democratic framework for something that has been exactly the opposite. So I can understand that in this transitional period, when the Soviet system ended on the one hand, and when the democratic system started its first very feeble steps, because actually there was no experience in democracy, there was no experience in freedom, there was always the sense of injustice, of oppression, but how to deal with it in a fair manner, and in a manner which is legally correct, is a very difficult task. And so the Lithuanians, as you very well pointed out, took it in toto and passed the laws and went all the way. And actually, in some ways, you can admire that. You said Estonians said, let's be easy. You call Latvians ambivalent, and I think you're completely right. I will express my own views, but these views are a little bit founded actually in what I have observed and what I have experienced and what I have studied. Actually, in the Latvian case, you have to keep in mind at least two factors. One of the factors is, which you mentioned correctly, the large number of immigrants, large numbers of Russians. Among these immigrants and Russians, large numbers of people in influential positions, including the Communist Party. The Latvian Communist Party never reached over 50% Latvians, Latvians included even those who came from Russia. So oftentimes when I have to explain communism in Latvia, I have to explain that even in the Communist Party there was this internal split in which the Latvian communists certainly must have felt the oppressed minority, and many, of course, were in the Latvian Communist Party because they wanted to live better, because they wanted to advance in life, and not because they wanted to be communists. So, in my own view, when the turn of events happened, the Latvian Communist Party just naturally split. Now, that of course doesn't take into account the victims, because if you're in the Communist Party, you are among the rulers, and so oftentimes there is in Latvia this view: if you were once in the party, if you were a communist, you are a communist like a Boy Scout. Once you were a Boy Scout, you're always a Boy Scout. But I wonder if the Latvian communists, the national communists, the successors of the national communists of the late 1950s had not come out and had not participated in trying to set up and build up this new state, we would have had a great deal of trouble. Because again, on the other hand, the great patriots obviously knew what they did not want, but they had really hardly any and couldn't have any experience in dealing with matters of state or dealing with bureaucracy and so on. So to some extent, this is one of the sides. So the Russian side and the communist side, which was also dominated by Russians. You had KGB people, you certainly had managers a lot. Latvians couldn't be directors of large industrial enterprises and so on. This was actually, as has been pointed out in research, Latvia's economy was basically 3/4 or more was geared towards the military-industrial complex of the Soviet Union. So you have a great deal of difficulties, and I can understand this ambivalence in dealing with the past, because you had to, on one hand, you had to really condemn acts against justice, acts against humanity. That's for sure. So I'm glad that some of it did take place, albeit a little bit belatedly. The one area we have had some difficulty is meting out justice against those who perpetrated crimes against humanity, genocide against the Jews. On the other hand, as the research has pointed out, many of these people have been brought to justice, albeit again on the Soviet side, they were brought to justice for other reasons than actually genocide against the Jews. But to some extent, again, if we go to the social side of the issue, we go to the social side and we find out that actually socially, in the social area, Holocaust has not been worked out. Ist nicht aufgearbeitet worden. It still is a very touchy issue, which comes out when we deal with restitution of properties. And I can see all the sides of this issue. And then sometimes, of course, the question comes up, isn't it just simply that we have not come to terms with that issue? But we also have not come to terms also with our Soviet past. We have to keep in mind that certainly we could look at all this occupation, starting with the first Soviet occupation, the German occupation, and the second Soviet occupation, that there were victims, and the victims oftentimes became perpetrators, and perpetrators became victims again. And that confuses the issue of justice and truth tremendously. So here we are dealing with issues which I call moral, psychological. The fact that during the Soviet rule, society could not freely exchange opinions or deal with these issues, at best in family circle, at best among very good friends, but mostly not at all, or in half sentences. Such huge events, dramatic, tragic events as deportations, you were not allowed to mention them. You were not allowed, and when people, when a writer writes about deportations or writes about such an issue as the Latvian Legion under Nazi rule, then you run into official trouble and you become a victim of persecution, or at least denial of publication, and so on. I am very glad, though, that we have put out these two very large volumes that the Latvian State Archive prepared about the deportations, the list of deportees. Right now, the Latvian State Archive is working on a much huger project. It's the list of all victims of Soviet persecution and so on, which I am told potentially numbers over 200,000. We know the lists of deportees. We also know the lists that Kāras Kangers, Rudīta Vīksne put out from the KGB files. About 50,000, 49,000, 50,000 people in that, again, in that big book. but apparently this number is going up, and I was involved in trying to involve the archive in an international project which is trying to recognize the victims and the resistors. And oftentimes, of course, the resistors are the victims and so on. You cannot separate them. As for memory, I will speak a little bit pro domo about the Occupation Museum. These days, Eva-Clarita, I'm afraid that in your memory there will be another little line like that which will be white. You remember the line you said that was the Cheka debate about the Cheka. That Cheka debate is not over yet, as you know. Right now, people who are involved really don't know whether that commission is going to get going or not get going. And one of the difficulties, I think, with the commission is that it is doing the right thing. It is not going to look into the Cheka, the KGB as such alone, but also the connections to the Communist Party, on how the Communist Party actually was the driving force behind the Cheka. And when you come then to the communists and to those who were actually in power positions, there are still quite a few around us these days. But back to the memory and to the white line. I look at the old Occupation Museum building, the black building across Daugava. I stand in the big project of Gunnar Birkats, this National Library, and he designed for us an edition which will be white, in white Finnish granite. And he gave us a metaphor, just as he gave a metaphor to this building. And the metaphor was from the dark past to the white and to the translucent future, to this clarification. We designed a new exposition. The idea of the exposition follows this metaphor, which we always had. We will go through the exposition and go up the stairs to a balcony from which we look back at the dark past, at the oppression, and yet we are liberating ourselves from it. Now, there are some architects who want to tear down this white edition even before it is built. The plans are ready, but there is a big battle going on. If these architects succeed, the Occupation Museum, and I thank you for the words you devoted to the museum. I think they're a little bit overstated, but I will accept them, especially in this time of difficulty that we are facing. So I hope that the memory preservation and the truth-telling about history is going to go on, and that we will be able to do it in the building that will be able to take in many more visitors than we can possibly in our temporary quarters. For me, it is a great distress that we can take in about, our visitor numbers are about 25,000. And in the old museum we had about 100,000. In the rebuilt building we can take in about 200,000. And that is a great number. We can do much more of the work that we did. At any rate, I hope that this will not come to pass, because otherwise we are not going to be able to do what we have to do, especially at this time. And I'm afraid that if this memory work gets stuck for several more years to replan and redo, the Occupation Museum is not going to be effective any longer. We are proud of what we have done. People internationally and otherwise have commended us as the the most important memory institution in Latvia. And we want to continue it. And your book certainly is a good statement, a wonderful statement about how we have dealt with it. And it's a good thing maybe that the three nations have dealt with it in slightly different ways. It means that we have dealt with it not somehow from some kind of matrix that was brought in from above, but that it was built from within, with the means, and maybe also with the psychological attitudes that these nations have. But at the same time, it's a good thing we were together in this. We are still together in this. And as I said, it's a wonderful example of Baltic studies, and I hope there will be many more to come.